Good morning. The Gospel reading of Mark is a story about faith. I would like to share my story of faith that has led me here today. Growing up, I was under the impression that there were 4 religions: Catholic, Congregational, which to this day I have no idea what that is, Lutheran, and the Jews. I was raised Lutheran Missouri Synod, even though I lived in Wisconsin, because the Wisconsin Lutherans didn't quite do things right, according to my family. But neither did the Catholics, the Congregational Church, and especially the Jews. It often confused me and sometimes bothered me because it was never truly explained to me why we, the Missouri Lutherans, were going to heaven, but everyone else wasn't. One of my favorite sayings is that everyone has a story. Some stories are great, some sad, some happy, and some just ordinary. But the story's true value is held in the ear and the heart of the listener. I was raised in an area of the world that was lacking diversity and culture outside the northern Midwest, and everyone had a similar story. For the most part, everyone looked the same, shared mostly the same values, religion, and household, despite a few differences. However, I was one of those kids who touched everything and questioned everything even more. For example, while sitting in service at church, thumbing through everything that I could possibly reach in the pew in front of me, I would ask my mom, "Mom, why don't they let women be ministers?" And my mom, who is great, would say, "Well, that's just the way it is, honey." And then I would say, "Well, Mom, that's just dumb." And my great mother would say, "Well, maybe someday that will change, and you can be a minister." Of course, that would always make me happy and momentarily content, but doubt would still fill my mind. However, there was still faith in my heart that said otherwise, and I believe that there was more to all of this. As a young adult of 18, I joined the United States Army. Talk about an immediate exposure to diversity. Wow and shock all at the same time. But I loved it. Finally, diversity. And as time went on, after 4 years, I exited the military and I joined the Los Angeles Police Department, where I met even more people from all over the world, both professionally and personally. And by that time, I obviously realized that there are more than 4 religions. However, this compounded my confusion as to why diversity was frowned upon where I grew up. Other churches had women ministers. Jewish people were faithful, kind, and friendly. People of other cultures were not weird and had wonderful traditions. Other churches loved and worshiped God, but had different ways of doing it. So with all this, I realized we all had one thing in common. We all possessed faith. In our gospel reading of Mark today, it speaks of faith. Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, knew Jesus was near. He started calling out to Jesus. Despite the crowd's attempts to keep him quiet, Bartimaeus refused to be silent. It is questioned why the crowd, or even some of Jesus' disciples, attempted to keep him quiet. Could it have been because the disciples didn't want to overwhelm Jesus? Or maybe because of Bartimaeus' physical disability and dishonorable trait of begging could be a reason to exclude him from the procession. To this question, we may never know the true answer. But one thing I remember growing up was in church, you were supposed to fit a mold. And the people who felt they were closest to God because of who they thought they were made a point to judge others who didn't fit a mold they created, and even tried to outcast those individuals from church. So in my adult life, I started church hopping. I tried to stay within the Lutheran Church, mostly because I was familiar with it, but that wasn't working. I felt the same way I did growing up. I didn't fit the church's mold. I felt judged as soon as I walked in the door. The churches were also lacking in diversity in the clergy and the congregation, but not just in the general demographics of the church. They were lacking diversity in its message and teachings. There was no outreach to different communities. What about bridging relationships? What about spreading the good news of God? Am I missing something? Again, I began to feel disillusioned and disconnected. I had faith, but I lacked hope. So I started to attend church only on the C and the E, Christmas and Easter. But for Bartimaeus, he didn't care. He had strong faith and hope. He continued to reach out to Jesus by shouting. Bartimaeus kept his faith, even though those around him had tried to exclude him in their relationship with Jesus. Finally, Jesus heard him and called Bartimaeus to him. Once the people heard Jesus call to Bartimaeus, they changed their tune. The crowd then told Bartimaeus, "Go to him. He is calling you." When Bartimaeus reached Jesus, Jesus asked him, "What can I do for you?" And at that time, Bartimaeus asked Jesus to heal him. Jesus then said, "You are healed by faith alone." Bartimaeus regained his sight and continued to follow Jesus through his procession. So with only my C and E attendances at church, I was not feeling that my relationship with God was growing to the level I wanted it to be. I wanted it to grow more. I wanted to have that faith and hope that I felt as a young child to be restored. My faith was present, but my hope was dim. It was about 2.5 years ago, I found myself searching for a church as Easter was rapidly approaching. I already had lived in Oak Park for 3 years, and the day before Easter, I was driving up Canaan to the market to pick up food for my annual Easter feast. My significant other, Michelle's mother, was in the car with me, and we were driving up Canaan, and we were talking about churches. As we passed Churchwood Drive, she said to me, "Hey, why don't you go to that church right there?" And I said, "I am unsure what that church is. It's Episcopal or something like that." And she laughed and said, "It's Episcopal, Celeste. And they are one of the most diverse churches in the world." I whipped a U-turn. I pulled in the driveway. I wrote down the web address off the bulletin board out front. I went home. I looked up the Sunday service time. I called Michelle. I told her about the church, and we decided to attend the Easter service the next morning. When we arrived, there were a lot of people here. And as we started walking towards the door, I had anxiety with flashbacks of judgmental stares that I had received from attending other churches. But as I looked around, I wasn't getting stared at. And as we entered the church, this wonderful, happy man standing in a white robe looked at me and smiled. And in a British accent, he said, "Good morning. Happy Easter." I greeted him back. I felt immediately welcomed and at ease. I looked at Michelle and smiled, and we took our seats. The service started, and the church filled with music as a procession circled the congregation 3 times. Then I heard a voice say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen." Not only does the resurrection of Christ bring me much warmth and love into my heart, but the voice that was proclaiming the resurrection of Christ was a woman's voice. After the service, I did some research on the Episcopal Church and learned that the beliefs of God and Christ were similar or mirrored to what I had learned and what I believed. Except one thing was different. Everyone is included. Here, all are welcome. So I never turned back. My faith had been strengthened, and that hope that I was lacking before had been restored. And since then, I have attended church more in the past 2.5 years than I did in the previous 20 years. But I did more than attend church. Like many other people before me, I got involved. I started to volunteer, and I pledged. I wanted to give back to God and to the church. And by doing this, I realized that the hope I was lacking represented my blind faith. And by blind faith, I mean faith that lacks understanding, clarity, and vision. Just like Mark's story of Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus had strong faith. However, the people who were surrounding him had blind faith. When Jesus called Bartimaeus to him, the crowd then acknowledged Bartimaeus in a positive way. So Jesus' miracle not only